Good morning. My name is Christina Aguilar. I'm the Plant Records Manager at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania. And I have the privilege to introduce the session entitled Prioritization for Plant Collection, Planning, and Utilization. It's a lot of big words, and I hope that I could get through prioritization a lot today, the word. So as public gardens, we all collect and grow plants, and we work hard to build and manage these collections. But when construction projects arise or natural disasters are imminent, how do we know which of these collections to protect first? And how do we choose which ones get more staff time or budget allocations for example, interpretation projects or for PCN or Plant Collections Network accreditation? I recently received a promotional email. I'm sure you get these emails in your at work with the subject line reading, "Learn how to prioritize your work for maximum impact." And I thought, wow, this is what botanic gardens need to do. We need to look at our collections and prioritize for this maximum impact. Because we can't do everything well, so why not focus on our strengths? Today we have a panel of 5 speakers who will explain how prioritization can inform planning, programming, disaster preparedness, and PCN accreditation at public gardens. These 5 curatorial professionals will share why prioritization is institutionally beneficial and how information can be utilized. So first, our first speaker will be Cindy Newlander, the Associate Director of Horticulture at the Denver Botanic Gardens, who will talk about prioritization in times of construction. Then Rowan Blake, the Director of Living Collections at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, will discuss prioritization for disaster planning. Next, Martin Nicholson, Curator at the Hoyt Arboretum, will relate how plant verification influences prioritization. And after that, Ray Larson, Curator of Living Collections at the University of Washington Botanic Gardens, will talk about prioritization as an aid to strategic planning and PCN accreditation. Finally, Tony Aiello, Director of Horticulture and Curator at the Morris Arboretum, will explain how they use prioritization of their collections to develop public programming. Because we're on a tight schedule and we have a lot of great presentations here, we wait to the end of presentations if we have time for questions. Thank you very much. Cindy?
Thank you, Christina. So does this look familiar to anybody in your institution? So today I'm going to be walking you through some of the decision-making processes that we've been making over the past 10 years through multiple areas of construction at Denver Botanic Gardens. So this is our site here, as captured on a Google Earth photo from 2007. At that point in time was when we were starting to make vast improvements across our grounds at the garden's 25-acre York Street site. As an institution that had recently celebrated our 50th anniversary, it was time for us to refocus again on our infrastructure and start to rebuild the gardens for the next century, for both our staff and visitors alike. So through a mix of funding that's included donations, city bonds, and grants, over $110 million has been raised and now used for a multitude of projects both above and below ground as part of our Flourish Capital campaign. So you can see these areas noted in yellow are the ones that have been impacted by this construction over this past decade and have now been completed through these processes. Some of these projects were cosmetic, such as realigning the pathway to the Japanese garden to improve the views as one enters the space, while others have created new opportunities to build stronger collections, such as a new greenhouse range and indoor display areas, or creating new opportunities for visitor experiences, such as our Mordecai Children's Garden, which is built on top of our new parking structure, and the Science Pyramid, which took the place of a pyramid mostly dominated by grasses. Much of the area that was impacted by construction were parking lots, rooftops, community garden plots, or areas that were kind of light on documentation and overall collections value. Orange has denoted the area where our collections are now, were collection-centric prior to collection. Our impacted collections were enhanced through infrastructure improvements, such as for our rose garden, which was moved to a new area, as well as our cutting garden. The community gardens were relocated to a better location off-site. In all, 16 new garden areas were created at the York Street site, along with the new cafe, the science pyramid, greenhouses, parking structure, and visitor center. The new gardens created through this process are much more collection-centric, as noted in orange, or program-centric in the purple than their previous locations were. One of the highlights of our new areas is the step garden, which now completed in 2015, which focuses on plants from our sister areas from around the world in Patagonia, South Africa, and Central Asia. So we are now focused on our fourth and final phase of the Master Development Plan and have broken ground on a new building that will house a library, herbarium, auditorium, classrooms, research laboratories, staff offices, and underground parking, as well as a new entry garden and rain garden demonstration area. The Frayer Newman Center replaces what was historically a community garden area and was more recently used for staff parking, nursery space, and material storage. The exterior of this area was shade garden and streetscape planting with a mixture of ornamental trees, shrubs, and herbaceous perennials. Today I'll focus on this particular area and how we have managed the prioritization of collections during this construction timeframe. So how have we dealt with the plants that have existed in the multitude of gardens undergoing change? How have we made sure that we are saving the right plants before it is too late? How do we avoid regret at the demise of plants that should have been saved but weren't? So over the past decade, we've been really working to hone our skills at prioritizing plants that have collections value. We have certain questions we ask when we embark upon each project. Working with landscape architects and staff, we make use of the data held in our collections database to make these decisions. We may not always be able to save everything, but by asking ourselves these questions, we are able to save the most important plants within our collections. Starting off, we look at which plants are unique to only that location in the gardens. While uniqueness may not be the top factor for saving something, this is an initial question that yields quickly those one-of-a-kind plants that are only in that one location and may be worth saving for our future. Next, we look at the provenance to determine which plants have come from wild collecting expeditions or index seminum, whose genetics may not be replaceable. We also look at the original source of the plants. We may see plants that have originated from USDA or other introduction programs that we wish to save. We can then look at the names of those plants, the cultivars, which ones are still available commercially. We can do quick searches on Google or nursery catalogs to find that out. We also pay attention to trees that have obtained champion status, or also those plants that are as part of one of our nationally accredited collections, either Alpines of the World or our oak collection. We also will look at plants that have gone through verifications, as we learned from Boyce and Michael Dosman yesterday. And those plants that have gone through that process, which is obviously very time-consuming, and seeing if some of those are also have that value to them. We will also look very closely at plants, especially trees, determining if they are in good health and have a good form and are worthy to be moved. Finally, we may consider that some plants that we know are visitor favorites and ones that those may be worth focusing on saving. So the image on this slide is of one of our state champion trees. a needle juniper that was relocated originally from the area of our current children's garden to this streetscape and has now been relocated a second time to the rock alpine garden, which we hope will be its forever home now. So this is an example of a map that I created about a year ago as we started this process working with the landscape architects. As you can see, I've basically went through and color-coded based upon the recommendations from the landscape architects, with green being trees that were staying according to the plans. Red X's were ones that, according to the landscape architects, would need to be removed. Orange with the little question mark were ones that perhaps could stay, perhaps could be replaced. The orange without question marks were our two champion trees that had been relocated to that site, so that needle juniper as well as a Bosnian pine. And then we also had a blue ones for ones that might stay or might go. Through the process of working through looking at this site and working with our landscape architects, we actually ended up making some different changes on there. We also made a lot of notes on these maps as well, of ones that we could hand dig, ones that would need spades to be moved, and so on. So then this is the accompanying inventory to go with that map, just a portion of it. The yellow highlighted plants were ultimately moved to a different location, with the circled ones denoting those that were moved with the tree spade. Green highlighted plants were protected on site. Using the questions that I posed previously, we found that this area had only a handful of truly important plants for the collections. The two champion trees I previously mentioned, one of which was determined would be protected on site, as it was right on the edge of the construction zone. The other was spaded and relocated to the rock garden. Other trees were hand dug and relocated. So there's a few different ways that we can consider how to save those important plants. Of course, saving in place is always desirable, but not often possible. In the case of this project, state champion Bosnian pine that was protected on site was in return saved 3 more trees from being removed, 2 Montgomery spruces and a weeping white spruce. It was helpful that the architects were really willing to work with us to modify the plan to save that Bosnian pine on site rather than moving it again. Not all trees could be saved in place, though. This Pinus flexulis Cesarini blue was the only one of its kind on site, and we also judged it to be in good condition with a desirable shape. Access is one of the challenges we face on our site. We don't have many sidewalks that allow for equipment much larger than a skid steer or a lift, so we knew that we would not be able to relocate this tree inside of our gardens proper. Fortunately, we were able to find a location on the garden's edge where this pine now creates a backdrop to our bonsai garden and also helps to screen the neighboring apartment building that is part of our urban site. Propagation is another means for moving collections without having to move the entire plant. While we didn't make use of propagation techniques during this particular project, in the past we have made use of taking cuttings or seed collections for example, our trough garden relocation of wildflower treasures. We also do maintain a seed bank for many different species within our collections, which allows us to start new plants at a later date. While we're already in the midst of the big dig with kind of a very deep hole starting to emerge in our back parking, or what was formerly our back parking area, we are already starting to identify the next locations for garden renewal. We're starting now to look at redesigning our perennial garden walk, the O'Fallon Perennial Garden, which has been well over 20 years old. And this is right now a staff-led process with installation planned for 2021. We're really looking through this lens that I've already described to you, trying to determine which ones are the most important plants that we should be saving for either reuse in other gardens or reuse in this future and reimagined perennial garden. So I hope that through the course of today's discussion, I've given you some ideas of what you can do when it comes time for bulldozers and wrecking balls to come into your institution, and I hope that you can help save the most important plants to you. And next up, we'll have Rowan.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the committees for my invite to talk to you today. Oops, back. Good start. Right. I'm going to talk about using our plant family collection as a pilot area for core collections prioritization and disaster planning at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So I'm going to talk a bit about disaster planning at BBG, some resources, core collections prioritization, and a summary. So about Brooklyn Botanic Garden, it's a 52-acre garden established in 1910. It was an urban botanic garden when it was established. It's in a cultural quarter surrounded by Prospect Park and a zoo, the Borough Museum and Central Library, and we have some stats there about the collections that we have. So the history of disaster planning at BBG. These are some recent disasters. First of all, there rosette disease in 2005, and we pretty much had to replant our entire rose garden, which is quite a substantial rose garden. Then being in the coastal northeast, Tropical Storm Irene and Superstorm Sandy, and I'll show you some images of that. Flooding in our plant records room, and it wasn't water that flooded into our plant records room. Now, I better qualify that. As with other institutions, we have to have income generation on site, and we had a kitchen put on the story above, and it was actually grease traps, because if you have commercial kitchens, you have to capture grease, and so we had a grease flood into our plant records room. And so in 2017, the organisation updated its disaster plan, but one thing that was not part of that was, excuse me again, really kind of specific collections details in that. So this is an aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. So both with Irene and Sandy, there's obviously the immediate effect, but there's also salt spray as well. And we found that even up to 5 years after the storms, we were having conifers die off from salt spray that occurred. And so in the aftermath of Sandy, New York did a lot to, including this is public maps based on a NOAA LIDAR survey, very sophisticated modelling. Our risk zones within the city are almost to a block. They're detailed that you can say city block by city block. This is the risk level for certain things. So you can see that the star in the middle there, that is Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So we're out the way of immediate flooding, but obviously wind and salt spray are still huge risks for us. So I obviously have to mention APGA disaster planning resources. So for those in the US, there's details about FEMA and the resources available and grants available, and then obviously within the Library and Media Centre resources. But I would like to mention how other sectors, whether it's cultural heritage or whether it's herbaria, are looking at risk assessments across multiple sites. So the top two are current projects soon to be published. And one I'd like to draw your attention to is Tom Strang's work from the Canadian Conservation Institute, and he hopes to have an entire data set online where individual institutions are mapped out against all sorts of known environmental risks like storms, earthquakes, forest fires, and he's kind of categorized, including gardens, cultural institutions all across North America in his modeling, and has relative risk ratings for them. Barbara Thiers at New York Botanic Garden has done a global study of risk to herbaria, and because herbaria are often co-located with botanic gardens, again, looking at not in her study not only natural disasters, but also institutional risks as well. And from my home country, Historic England has produced a series of worksheets that step you through very localized site risk guidance, including things like materials that you can hand over to a local fire department, or grab lists, so that somebody actually in the middle of an emergency can locate information. Okay, so a bit about our plant family collection, and really the opportunity coming up to look at the core collections prioritization. The plant family collection is 16.5 acres of the 52, and it was laid out in evolutionary order following the Engler system. So our living collections policy document said there are gymnosperms and there are angiosperms, but it didn't actually pick out the individual families that it considered core to those areas. And the disaster plan did not identify significant specimens based upon that. And so it was an opportunity to use our plant family collection as a pilot for core collections prioritization and disaster plans. So we went through, similarly, we went through a condition survey, looking at the conservation status and availability of plants. And because the original area was very much laid out systematically, we decided to focus on developing a planning tool that would help us with the prioritizations using those considerations, systematics and the actual physical layout. So this is an aerial photo. You can see a construction project looming on the right-hand side of the screen, and gradually that construction has been working its way all through the garden. So this was how the garden was laid out originally. Right from the early days, it's the systematic section, one of 10 sections in the garden. And so you can maybe see on some of the larger type in the bottom left, you can see individual families and orders picked out for visitors to see and move through the landscape. So on the left-hand side of the screen, ferns and conifers, and then gradually higher and higher in plant evolution towards the right-hand side, this kind of southern end. So this was our first attempt at kind of, can we look at how the collections had kind of, not exactly degraded, but these very defined structures had somewhat fragmented. And so I decided to run in GIS some plant locations, consider their families and their orders they fit within, and are there kind of continuous areas. So we gave them all an equal amount of space, and can you see a pattern in there? And the answer was no. It's pretty difficult. Difficult to, especially on the left of the screen where the conifers are all interplanted, their families are all interplanted. And so giving that kind of document to say, work with landscape architects or work with an interpretation team and say, can you make sense of that, was a non-starter really. So luckily, Smith College was developing their plant family collection, and when they were doing some research through their archive, they found at that point, we did not know about this plan for our systematic section from 1922, and it has done a much better job than I could in defining the areas and kind of visualizing them so that we could communicate to various partners, this is what we're doing with our collections. So I went away and I thought, okay, so if I did this in Microsoft Paint or whatever, because these areas all intermingled and overlapping, can we identify which collections will be our priorities based on overlapping areas? And so yes, it kind of worked out, but then we had 20 plus plant orders and quite a tight turnaround before the construction would move along. And so we had to look at kind of modeling the outcomes. So our plant database on the left, we fed information from our condition surveys and availability, then in the center, feeding it into a GIS model so that we could replicate that for every family or order, and then iterate it every time you wanted to say, well, what happens if we took this plant out or transplanted this to there, how would things look? And then we could produce order and family maps that were clear enough to actually communicate to people of different disciplines. And as I say, they adjust and repeat as many times as required. And so we ended up with, every time we ran the model, we'd have a series of maps defining the plant orders or plant families as we needed. And this is the kind of final thing for the pinales. You can see there are obviously outliers. And so they were the kind of things that we wanted to take into consideration. What do we do? Do we remove? Do we transplant? Do we kind of just manage this out in the longer term? So we were able to kind of identify our outliers easily. And here's an example of, where we've got very strong clusters, and we can say, okay, this is quite obviously going to be our oak and the like collection, walnuts. So in summary, we were able to identify core collections and include those in our draft disaster plans, and we were able to identify and reinforce the very strong structure that was still there within the collections. We could prioritize those collections and communicate with others. Identify outliers for repropagation, replacement, transplant, or removal. And I'd like to acknowledge that this isn't suitable for every collection, but it was very suited to the history, the modern history of the site, and the kind of design intention of the collections originally. And for our onward disaster plans, it helped us identify the significant species and the areas that we wanted those to be located in, and that it enabled the next steps which we were taking, which is to then identify the kind of core business areas or safety emergency access areas that we need to keep clear. And so we could pick out individual specimens and say, okay, we need to repropagate this because if it came down in a storm, we would have to clear it straight away to keep the business running and to keep things going. And so it enabled us to have, key specimens ready for repropagation. Okay, thank you.
Hello. I'm Martin Nicholson. I'm at the Hoyt Arboretum, Portland, Oregon, about 6 hours south from here. And the sun is shining in Portland too, so it's nice there apparently. I'm doing it as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit, it's more, I suppose, a little bit of a story about where Hoyt is at right now as far as how we consider prioritization and going from a fairly old garden. We are in our 90th year this year, 200 acres, so it's a pretty big garden, and fairly small staff. So combined, Portland Parks and Recreation staff combined with the Hoyt Arboretum Friends, we're about 8 people, and so we run the site. We get some support from the Parks Department for building maintenance and those type of things. We don't have to deal with that part of it. But I know there's a lot of gardens out there that are smaller gardens, and so we just wanted to talk about kind of how do you deal with this idea of prioritizing. So we're a global tree collection, and we are the PCN collections. We're with the multi-site group for Acer and Magnolia, and we're a Western region conifer reference garden with the American Conifer Society. That's probably what we're most well known for, is our conifer section. So you're not going to be able to read all these little numbers, but this is just a summary kind of where we're at. So we have about 1,700 individual species, and I think the most important thing is that species determined, we're about 693, species not determined, 880. So just to get you an idea of where we're at on this process of figuring out exactly what we have. I should hit the other button. There we go. So I attended my first APGA meeting about 10 years ago in St. Louis. I was really new to a curatorial job. I'd been working as a horticulturist. I wasn't totally sure what I got myself into. And I went to Michael Dozeman's talk. Michael's in here somewhere. And he had this whole thing about idea. And do you remember that talk, Michael? If you still stand by it, I don't know. But I was going back through my notebooks and I found all these little notes I wrote that day about, what should I be doing as far as conservation. And so the idea was identify, define, evaluate, and act. And I was like, this is pretty good. That's pretty simple steps. Know what you have. And then the other one, I said, you need to know what you have and what the value is in order to have any thought of conservation. So whether that conservation is genetic conservation or just conservation of your plant collection, if you don't really understand what you have, how can you talk about it? How can you do anything about conserving it and prioritizing it? So I went back to the Arboretum and I thought, wow, I don't have any people to do this with. What am I going to do? So how do you get this process started? And I thought, well, really what we need to do is figure out what we have. And we're in the midst of changing a database. We got all that sorted out. And weirdly, at the time, we had a public garden in Portland that closed, was the Berry Botanical Garden. And they had a taxonomist on staff who I had met. And the first time I met her, I was like, I really need you to come and work for me. I don't have any money or anything to pay you, but it'd be really cool because we need a taxonomist because we need to figure out what it is we've got. And so Erin came and actually volunteered for me a little bit, and we talked about what it might look like to try and do verification. We went out and just looked at some things we knew were big problems, a couple of things, there were no IDs, things that, you walk past them every day and you're like, there's no way that is what it is. There was a hawthorn that, all of our hawthorns basically came in as the wrong ID, not the whole group, but just as one species. And so we just wanted to be able to verify that. So we started with those basic things and then we set up a herbarium. And I don't know how this worked. We had a budget freeze. We weren't allowed to do any hiring in the city of Portland. And I actually wrote a letter to supervisor and I said, this is what I need. I need a year to pay somebody to do this job. And can I have, I forget what I asked for, $10,000 or $20,000 for that position. And they said yes. And that was 8 years ago and they're still paying for that position, which is really awesome. So don't tell them. So if you see anyone from City of Parks, we were talking about it on the way up here. Once you get the yes, it's good. You just keep going, right, until someone tells you to stop. So it seemed like it worked out. So I hired, Erin came on and worked part-time. She left 3 years ago. Yeah, Mandy's nodding in the back. And Mandy too, who's here. Mandy had a poster last night talking about a herbarium set up and sort of explaining what those steps were. So Mandy's been with us the last 3 years. She's part-time as a taxonomist. We're really lucky to have someone with that skill level who's kind of organizing things. She picked up from what Erin had created and just kind of continuing that process. And it seems like a big thing just to decide to do a herbarium, right? It's 4 cabinets. It sits in our library, and that's our herbarium. It's a totally shared space. It's not like we build a custom air-conditioned space with 100 cabinets and benches and everything. I bought the cabinets for $100 from UBC when they built the Beatty Biodiversity Museum because they cleared out all their old cabinets. So, sometimes you can find ways to make these things work, and it just seemed like it was really important in order for us to go forward. So we created a herbarium, and now we have vouchers, and it was really good. I went the wrong way. So the problem with finding out what you have is that it reveals the good things and the ugly things, right? So sometimes what you have labeled isn't what it is. So like I said, all of our Crataegus lavigata that came in from a nursery source years ago, back in the 50s, were all Crataegus monogyna, which is a huge weed problem on the West Coast. And so now we know those are really bad and we can get rid of them. But not only that, when I emailed someone and said, hey, we're going to cut these down because they had an interest in our hawthorn collection, and they're like, but they're really big, nice trees, how can you remove them? Well, because they're not what they're supposed to be, right? So now you have justification because it doesn't fit with your collections policy and all these pieces don't line up. The cool thing was things like Acer chicanense came in wild collected seed lot as Acer campbelli. At the time, I think that species, there was maybe only a handful of them even in the United States, so we had some nice big trees of a fairly uncommon species at the time. So one of the other things is, once you're in this process and you're doing all this verification, there's other good things that come out of it. One of the big things is now we've got really good documentation. So we have a herbarium voucher, we have a record that shows what the name changes were, but also why they were changed. So if someone else comes in and says, hey, how come you changed the name of this? You can go back and pull out the herbarium voucher, or you can send it to them, and you have some sort of documentation as to what your process was. And I'm going to show a picture of some of our old records that process is a little vague sometimes. You also, now we have a whole good set of images that are in a database that are available for people to check, and those images can then be used as in-hand references. We get a lot of urban forestry, street tree requests, and we like being able to have in-hand documentation to show what those are, so we can do comparisons. We also bring in a whole new pool of volunteers. Not every volunteer wants to work out in the garden. We brought in volunteers that are kind of more artistic folks who want to work in the herbarium. And then we found they're like graphic designers, and they have all these other skills, and they designed interpretive panels for us, and they wrote articles. So you bring in a whole pool of folks that are actually like a different pool of your typical volunteer. And so that was really useful as well. And then we also were able to increase our education capacity because Mandy teaches classes and Erin did as well. And so, and those classes bring in a slightly different skew of people as well. So there's all these extra value from going all that here. So here's our herbarium and our library. Here's some, actually some horticultural stuff. These are actually retired parks horticulturists. They really wanted to get into an entire genera. And then lots of, taking taxonomy out into the field and really teaching the things that we have in the herbarium and then taking that into the field to see what's out there. And then herbarium, some of our old records, so we're an older institution, we have paper copies. It's hard to read, but the one up on the top right, there's just a circle that says all these group were changed. The name was changed to this, and that's it. There's no note as to why or what the backup is. It's just like we just decided to change all of these ones to this thing. And we can't figure out any reasoning why they just decided to make that change. So now we have to go back and look at all those. But if it was documented well at the time, we can then go, oh yeah, okay, they changed it because of these reasons, and then we can decide, was that the right reason? But now we're backtracking and we're repeating work that was done before, and hopefully you're continuing to grow and move forward in your organization, not have to repeat the same process over and over. So some records are really good. Wow, that one did not come out at all. Sorry about that. So this is kind of the end thing, but the idea, once you have verified plant material, then you can assign value. But if you don't have verification, you can't assign value. So the collections policy defines roles, defines the role and priority, defines role and priority, and becomes the gauge for determining the value of an accession to your organization. So whether it's conservation, research, education, nice place to walk, whatever it is that has value in your organization through your collections policy, you still have to know what the plant is to assign value and prioritization within your organization. So that's kind of the punchline. And so the last thing on Michael's list was ACT. So that's the next step is hopefully you can take something away from all the discussion over the last couple of days back to your organization and find a way down the path, and it'll help out.
Oh, I've got your notes up here, but I can probably use those still. Thank you all for being here. I'm Ray Larson, the curator of living collections at the Washington Park Arboretum, part of the UW Botanic Gardens, and we're just 2.5 hours south, so if you make a day of it, and before you visit Martin, come see us. So strategic planning is kind of a buzzword in business these days and in organizations. For plant collections, this comes into play because most institutions have plant collections with particular areas of strength or focus, and this can be based on your garden's mission, the growing conditions of your particular area or that favor particular collections, or the interests of past staff. So how can you best document these collections, and how can this process help with your institution's strategic planning and prioritization? And specifically, how can the Plant Collections Network tools provide a framework for measuring and demonstrating the value of plant collections to garden leadership and the public? How can you make your case through collections? So what are your perceived collection strengths? At the UW Botanic Gardens, we went through our last master planning process in the late 90s, culminating in our 2001 master plan. And this really led us to consider what collections are the most important to us and what was needed to maintain and improve them. Historically, our previous directors and curators have assembled a really broad range of plants from the temperate world. We're fortunate that we can grow a lot of things well, but over the years, this has led to some areas that just naturally have collection strength for certain families or genera. Of these about 12 or 13 core collections, Acer, Magnolia, Quercus, and Ilex had the most potential for initial recognition. So the PCN accreditation process gave us the tools to help us measure and demonstrate the values of these collections. And this really helped us focus our time and efforts on documenting these, and assessing them for potential accreditation. And this really sharpened what we did. We were able to collect the data that allowed us to show how these collections were special and what levels of documentation and horticultural care were needed to maintain and enhance them. So for strategic planning to be successful, there's a few really important things. They need to have a time limit, which is good for everybody. It just really helps you focus and get things done. You need to know what you're measuring, and you need to have actions that are truly reachable or achievable. So the goals, I mean, this seems obvious, but you need to have a specific definition. So what kind of collection are you looking to assess or make sense of? And then what is the time frame? You need to set a time limit so you can work toward that. You can work backwards toward that. And then set up the measuring steps. And that may sound easy, but really getting into those details is really how you're going to make sense of this. And what steps are achievable, very important. It doesn't really matter what your plan is. You've got to manage it and break it into parts that are really something you can actually do. And then that's how you assign who's responsible for what steps. So one of the tools, even if you're not looking to have a nationally accredited plant collection, is the Plant Collections Network has a progress self-assessment tool that's really valuable, and that provides a framework for evaluating the current level of collections management and steps you can take to set and achieve goals to improve standards and demonstrate excellence. The Compass for Progress self-assessment tool has 4 parts. There's scope standards that help you define the scope, conditions, and goals, and this is available on the Plant Collections Network website, the Collections Toolbox. Documentation standards lets you know where you're at in this process, good, better, best, for records, labeling, and inventory. And then use standards. How are you going to actually use this collection? What are your goals there? How are you going to share your information with other institutions or the public? And then management standards are defined. How much staff is needed to care for, and what is the funding level required. So once you've done that, you can really demonstrate the value of your collections, and you can promote it within the organization and externally. For us, this has really helped within our various organizations, our partners. These collections have been assessed. This is what we've done. This is what we've shown. This is what we found out. And these are why they're valuable to our institution. Yep, pressing the wrong button. So this also helps us show, not just to us, we already know what makes our plants special, but why are they special, for why should other people care about them, and why they should be of high priority. And that's why they deserve and require the funding and the staffing time and what that looks like. So here at the Gardens, we've now have a much better idea through this process of the resources and staffing needed to maintain and care for our most important collections. This was really important in the last recession. When it came time, we received most of our funding from the state of Washington and some other public sources, and that was being in danger of being cut. So we really used this accreditation process and what was important for our collections to kind of manage how we were going to retain those resources during that time, what things could be cut and what things could not be. And so in that sense, we really didn't cut any horticultural staff, which is unusual during times of downturn. So it's also allowed us to prioritize these resources and advocate them as part of a larger strategic planning effort that our garden is undertaking. And so basically, it's helped us raise the profile of our collections within the university, within the city, within the region, and that helps our case for funding and support. And it also provides recognition among and within other organizations, both nationally, internationally. And so this helps us when people come to us with research requests. Now we have very good documentation for these things, and we're being used increasingly as a resource for that. Thank you. Now, we've left a few minutes for Tony.
So while Cindy's doing that, I'll just say I'm Tony Aiello. I'm Curator and Director of Horticulture at the Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, so the other coast of this continent. And I'm going to talk a little bit about using collections for public programming, so a little bit of a shift from what we've been talking about for the last hour or so. So at the Arboretum, we have we have diversity of collections, and we do a lot of programming, whether it's professional or continuing education, children's programming based around these collections, whether they're our historic tree collection, whether it's hollies, conifers, which is another great strength of ours, our magnolia collection, which is a great attraction in the spring, or oaks. A lot of these are familiar to what people have been saying in this session, and maples as well. But what I want to talk about is sort of what comes first. What's the chicken or the egg? Do you build your collection first and then start programs, or do you have programs based on existing collections? So I'm going to have two examples, one of each. One, I don't know which is first, the chicken or the egg, but I'll have two examples that are a little bit different that demonstrate this. So we've had a witch hazel collection going back to our founders' times, and it's a collection that successive curators since probably the 1940s have continued to build and strengthen, and it's something that I inherited 20 years ago as a sort of foundational collection of the Arboretum, but really wanted to bring to a whole nother level. So starting in the early 2000s, we inherited a really good collection, but we also decided, along with a colleague, Chris Strand, who at the time was at Green Spring Gardens, which is one of the national holders of Hamamelis, to create this library collection and go to, in this case, England and Belgium, go to the original plants, propagate from those original plants, and try and create a sort of encyclopedic and a known verified collection. So this is the collection of Chris Lane, who is a collector and nurseryman in southern England. Here's Chris at his garden. We also went to Belgium, where a lot of the other varieties, this is Diane de Belder with Diane, the cultivar. So we went there and again went to the original plants, so we knew we were getting the correct plant, brought those back and propagated them. So this really was the foundation of really strengthening this collection. And we probably went from, I don't know the exact numbers, 20 or 30 taxa to somewhere around 75 to 80 taxa within this 8-year period or so. So this was, all well and good. I was enjoying these. I was, happy to go out and plant them and appreciate them. But we decided around 2010 to start a witch hazel festival. We call it Which Witch Hazel is Your Favorite? Not my name, but it's okay. And so it's a relatively small thing. So if you've ever been in Philadelphia in late February, it's not exactly the best time of year to be out. But it's a way of getting people into the garden and looking at collections, looking at plants. So it's a small event. We get a couple hundred people on the weekend that we do it, usually the end of February, early March. It's kind of hard to predict. But we've sort of made it into a family event and talk about the use of witch hazels, whether it's economically, whether it's for cosmetics, and horticulturally as well. So we do get a lot of families coming, enjoying them, and looking at the diversity of them. There's some crafts that we do around the flowers and around sort of the biology of it. And the main thing is to get people out into the garden at a time of year where our visitation is basically zero. And it's been successful. And we do teach some sort of master classes around this as well, so sort of for professionals and for other folks who want to get more advanced knowledge about witch hazels. And we've integrated it into our plant sale as well. So if our plant sale's in May, witch hazels are green in May if you're lucky. But it's a way of sort of building this interest in the plant group so that people come back to our plant sale, and we become known for having a really good selection at our sale a few months later. So that was sort of the having the collection first and then building a festival of sorts around that. And the other story I want to tell is kind of the opposite. It has to do with our flowering cherry collection, which again is a collection that our founders started. Actually, in the 19-teens, you could buy plants directly from Japan. They were shipped over. So some of the Yoshino cherries you see here were planted in the 19-teens by our founders. And so we had this strong collection, again, that had been developed and continually curated since the early 1900s up into the present time. And around the early 2000s, we started partnering with the Japan America Society of Philadelphia, who has a large cherry blossom festival in the spring. We're sort of overshadowed by our neighbor to the south, but it's a significant festival across Philadelphia. So we started partnering with them, having a whole series of events, having the cherry blossom queen come to the garden. This is probably the one year it didn't snow when she visited. And then, building sort of a cultural festival around what was a very strong collection. It took me a few years. There was sort of a lag in my thinking. I started to realize that, well, maybe we need to verify what we have as the first step and make sure that what we're displaying is actually appropriately named. This is a sort of iconic photograph at the Arboretum. You hate it or love it. Not my color combination. I've inherited that. And this is a plant I walk by probably every day, and it took me about 10 years to realize that it was misidentified. So sort of those kinds of things, it's all about observation. That's what I try and teach my interns and our staff, that you just open your eyes and just pay attention. I didn't do that, and so after 10 years I finally got it labeled correctly, which was a nice thing. Then started looking at extending the season. And we had a collection, this is around 2007, 2008. I had not planted a flowering cherry in my first 10 years at the Arboretum, and probably nothing had been planted in 15 years or so. So it was sort of not really aging, but I could see that it might be an aging collection before too long. So I started looking at some of the National Arboretum introductions that were some of the earlier flowering ones, looking at some of the traditional late flowering ones. This is Higurashi, kind of the non-Kwanzan, but a really fabulous flowering cherry. So looking at, building our collection that way by extending the season and really strengthening the collection and thereby strengthening the programming that we could offer around our Cherry Blossom Festival. So this led to a whole series of visiting other gardens, propagating plants from those other gardens, and really starting to build this collection. And we've continued this programming, and we have a whole series of events, demonstration events, whether it's the sword fighting, whether it's kimono dressing, whether it's sort of kids, arts and crafts kinds of things, origami kinds of activities. And then we also, or I actually teach again, sort of a master class. We call it Sakura, Sushi, and Sake. So people are really interested in coming for at least two of those things. And it's a way of really getting, sort of deep into the subject and really delving into it. Kind of an aside of, and I should say, this is really the festival and kind of the activities around our cherry blossom. We're moving away from the word festival. Our cherry blossom month has really been incredibly successful. It's not like Brooklyn where we get 40,000 people on a day, but the 2 or 4 days that we have the festival are our biggest visitation days of the year. So it's really pretty significant. And it gets a lot of different audiences there who don't come, and it really is a way of reaching a lot of different people around the area. So an offshoot of this is that I started going to other gardens in the Delaware Valley and up and down the East Coast, looking at which flowering cherries were held uniquely in those gardens, propagating those so we could have duplication, returning those to those institutions and planting them at our garden. in sort of inadvertently verifying not only our collection but their collections, this sort of grew into this whole program. So every spring I get to drive up and down the East Coast, look at flowering cherries for 2 weeks in April, and then go back and propagate them in June. So it's really been, personally really fabulous experience for the last 10 years. And we're trying to look at some way of marking the 10th year of our doing this program, some sort of symposium or some sort of major program around this, and we haven't quite gotten there yet. So visiting places like the Scott Arboretum, NYBG, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, really working with them to really duplicate some of these rare collections that we have. So the next thing I'm trying to propose at the Arboretum are some other festivals. So based on our city's namesake, the Philadelphia Festival, perhaps, that one hasn't gone over. It's be about a 1-minute festival. The hydrangea happenings, this one actually may have some traction. Douglas, Acer Days might be good. So just, some ideas, not being too facetious. But anyway, so in conclusion, sort of when looking at this, really, I think one of the lessons is that we really build on our strengths. I mean, these are collections that we had. We didn't need to start from scratch. We could continue programs that had been going on for decades. And then using those to, as I said, build and create audiences. And the witch hazels are a really good example that we were able to really get people interested in the group of plants that, as sort of horticulturists we love, but general audiences may not know that much. And then integrating programs across departments and even within my department. So I've been able to really convince the horticulture staff of the importance of these collections and the value of building them and really get their buy-in. And then leveraging these collections, again, both ways. With witch hazels, most of them are grafted, so this is a way of sort of leveraging the horticulture staff to prune out all that understock before the festival, so we have to tighten, clean house. But also, it's an argument for resources to build those collections and continue to enhance those collections and how it really influences everything that happens at the Arboretum. So with that, I think we're good, right? So thank you all, and do we have time for questions?
About 5 minutes for questions. Anybody? Do we have a runner today? No? Okay, thank you, everybody. Please, we have a question? Oh, question. Yes, Abby.
I'm just curious, for any of the prioritization that's gone on, have any of you assessed or looked at which collections are unique to your institution or super rare, and how do you use that information?
So we did, I kind of did some comparison. We were starting a 3-year revitalization, where it's turned into more of a 6-year project of our pine collection. And so actually I just used the Evercola listserv, and I just sent out an email and said, hey, does anyone want to send me their pine collection? I'm really curious how we compare to what else is out there. And I think I had 12 or 14 replies, some with just general notes, and some actually sent me their list of their pines for comparison. So that was one method.
We've done similar things with species collections, but getting back to the flowering cherry collection, when we got into this, I compared a number, maybe a half a dozen different collections, and looked at what we held that was unique and that we really needed to back up, and then in reverse, looked at other institutions in the same way for varieties that they held that were unique and that also needed to be backed up. So that was a way of really doing, I called it an analysis, it was basically just a spreadsheet, but it was a way of really kind of looking at a regional approach to cultivar diversity in that case.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you again. Thank all of our speakers one last time. Thank you.